I stood in the shadows of the wine cellar looking out at my son's wedding, glowing like a dream. People laughed. They raised their glasses. They clapped their hands. And I watched my wife. A light chain rested around her wrist. She was being led across the courtyard like part of the show. My daughter-in-law smiled. She called it special care. No one objected. No one thought it was wrong. In that moment, I understood something cold and clear. Some weddings are built on the silence of humiliation. Before I go on, if you're still here, please subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Because from that moment on, that beautiful wedding was no longer what stayed with me. What stayed was the feeling of realizing that some truths, if they are not spoken in time, will follow us for the rest of our lives. I did not step out right away. I stayed still in the shadows, my back against a cold wooden barrel, listening to the distant waves hitting the rocks, like the steady breathing of the Maine coast. The lights outside were so bright they made everything feel unreal. The music played just loud enough to cover the uncomfortable silences. It was a perfect wedding, if you only looked with your eyes and didn't look for too long. My wife stood in the middle of the courtyard. Betty wore the cream-colored dress I had pressed 3 times that morning. She was unsteady on her feet, but she still tried to smile at the people around her, the way she had learned to do over many years. She always believed that if she stayed pleasant, things would somehow turn out fine. I saw her wrist tremble slightly every time she moved. At first I thought it was just a decorative bracelet. Then the light slowly shifted, and I saw the thin line running from her hand to Heather's. It wasn't rough. It wasn't heavy. Light enough to look like an accessory. Subtle enough for strangers to think it was part of the setup. Heather leaned down and whispered something into my wife's ear, then laughed out loud. Betty nodded softly as if she had been told to stay still. Then Heather gently tugged her forward a few steps, pointing toward the flower petals scattered on the grass. "Could you pick those up for me?" I caught her saying. Her voice was sweet. Polite. Exactly the kind guests tend to like. Betty bent down. Slow. Awkward. A few people chuckled. Someone clapped. They thought it was a cute moment. A creative idea for an outdoor wedding. A way to include an older woman in the ceremony. I knew my wife didn't understand what was happening. She was only doing what she was told the way she did when a nurse asked her to sit down, or when a store clerk reminded her not to forget her purse. There was no fear in her eyes. Only a familiar confusion. That was what took my breath away. Jason stood nearby. My son wore an expensive suit, a glass of wine in his hand, nodding and greeting everyone he saw. He didn't look at his mother. He didn't look at me. His eyes were busy with handshakes, congratulations, and relationships he believed were his future. I remembered the message he sent that morning while I was helping Betty button her dress. "Dad, don't take Mom out too much today. I don't want any trouble. No concern. No worry. Just a clean request like reminding someone to lock the door." The music shifted to something more upbeat. Heather turned, slipped her arm through Jason's, and pulled him into the center of the courtyard to loud cheers. The thin line still kept Betty tied to the long table nearby, as if she were a fixed object that needed to stay in place. A woman standing close to me whispered to her friend that the bride was so thoughtful for being able to manage her mother-in-law at a crowded event like this. I felt my own hands start to shake, not from sudden anger, but from something heavier. A feeling of being pushed outside, as if I were watching a world I no longer belonged to. A world that was bright, polite, and completely comfortable with an older woman being treated like a prop as long as the party stayed smooth. I stepped further back into the darkness. No one noticed. No one looked for me. I wondered what I had missed over all these years. When my son learned to see his mother as an inconvenience. When he came to believe that other people's silence meant consent. Betty looked up, searching for me. Her eyes moved slowly across the crowd, then paused at the empty space where I was standing. I wasn't sure if she recognized me. But I was sure of one thing. If I stepped out at that moment, I would destroy what they were calling happiness. And then I understood the most bitter paradox of that day. At a wedding meant to honor family, the only thing truly forgotten was the family itself. I couldn't step into the courtyard then, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to understand where I stood in this story. I turned my back to the lights and followed the narrow hallway toward the rear of the estate. It was quieter there. Just the sea wind and the familiar smell of damp wood. In that silence, the things I had been avoiding for months began to line up into a clear, unbroken line. I remembered the day Jason told me he wanted to do something big. He stood in my old workshop, the place that once echoed with saws and hammers where I had worked for nearly 40 years. He said the coastal real estate market was rising, that this was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. I looked at Betty. She was sitting by the window, half in the present, half lost in old memories. She held my hand, as she always did, and said, "If our son needs it, we help." So we sold the boatyard. We sold the things that had been part of my life longer than almost any person. $500,000. Every dollar went straight into the seaside estate, under Jason's name. He spoke as if it were temporary. "I'll take care of you later, Mom and Dad," he said. I believed him, not because I was naive, but because I was his father. Heather appeared around that time. She always knew how to arrive at just the right moment. Every visit she spoke softly to Betty. She always called herself your daughter. She always seemed patient, but her eyes never stayed on the person in front of her. They moved across the house, the furniture, anything that could be turned into value. I had seen eyes like that down at the harbor. People who look at a boat not because they love it, but because they want to know how much it will sell for. Then the papers came. Jason said they were just to make things easier later. Medical power of attorney. Asset management support. He used terms I didn't know. He spoke fast, as if afraid I might ask questions. Heather sat beside him, nodding, sometimes placing a hand on his shoulder as if reminding him to stay calm. Betty signed. She signed because she trusted her son. I signed because I didn't want noise in the family. From that day on, the way they looked at us changed. Slowly, but clearly. No more questions. No more explanations. Decisions were announced, not discussed. We were arranged a place to stay. We were advised to limit our outings. I began to understand that in their eyes we were no longer parents. We were a risk to be managed. The night before the wedding, I didn't sleep. Betty went to bed early as usual. I sat in the downstairs hallway, where the lights were dim and no one passed through. When Jason and Heather entered the dressing room, they didn't fully close the door. I wasn't trying to listen. I just didn't leave in time. Jason spoke in a low, emotionless voice. He said everything was ready, that after tonight they would wrap things up cleanly. Heather laughed. Not a happy laugh. It was the sound of confidence, of someone who believes they have already won. She talked about a place far away, low cost, few questions, about closing the door on the past to open a new life. I stood there gripping the wooden railing and realized a truth harder to swallow than anything happening in the courtyard. My son was not being deceived. He was cooperating. He was not being manipulated. He was choosing. When I returned to the reception area, the lights were still bright. The music was still steady. No one knew, or no one wanted to know, that behind the congratulations was a plan already in place. Betty was still there within my sight, still obediently following small instructions. Each step she took pulled me years backward to the days when I held her hand along the docks, when she still remembered the name of every boat. I understood that if I stayed silent any longer, that silence would become evidence against us. But I also knew I couldn't react like an angry man. I had lived long enough to know that direct confrontation only makes doors close faster. I needed time, and I needed to keep Betty safe, at least for now. Outside, the wedding went on as if it were the most important thing in the world. And inside me, something else was forming. Slowly, steadily. Not anger, but a resolve to make sure our story would not end in darkness and someone else's arrangement. I returned to the reception as the sky grew darker. The lights were turned up, making everything look artificially bright. The music shifted again faster and happier, as if to carry everyone away from any thought too uncomfortable to name. I looked for Betty first. She was no longer in the center of the courtyard. I found her on the right side, near a long table covered with a white cloth set close to the edge of the stage. The hem of her cream dress was stained dark. A glass of wine had just been spilled. Whether by accident or on purpose, I didn't need to guess. Heather stood there leaning in, speaking to someone she called a support staff member. They moved quickly, efficiently, like they had rehearsed it. Within seconds, Betty was guided away from the main walkway and seated on a chair tucked into a shadowed corner. I walked faster. When I reached her, I saw that the thin line was no longer attached to Heather's hand. It had been secured under the leg of the table, low enough that no one would notice, hidden enough that Betty couldn't get up and walk away. She sat there, both hands resting on her lap, her eyes moving around as if searching for something familiar that had vanished. Heather bent down, brushing Betty's dress lightly, her voice so sweet it put everyone else at ease. She said Betty needed to rest, that the crowd was tiring her. A few guests nodded in agreement. They liked order. They liked things being handled. I said Betty's name. She looked up, and in that moment I saw confusion turn into relief. She recognized me, or at least the feeling of safety that came with me standing there. I bent down and placed my hand on her shoulder. I reached for the line. Jason appeared right then. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply stood between me and Betty just enough to keep others from noticing. He said I was making things awkward, that I should trust their arrangements, that this was not the time to draw attention. I looked at my son. I waited for hesitation, for a small crack in his confidence. I saw none. Instead, I saw the impatience of a man afraid his plan might slow down. He placed his hand on my chest. Not hard, but firm enough to push me back one step. No one saw it as a problem. In the noise of music and laughter, one step back by an old man meant nothing. I understood then that I was standing in front of an invisible wall, not built of brick or stone, but of circumstance and quiet cooperation. I stepped back, not because I accepted it, but because I needed to see the full shape of the trap. I walked around behind the estate, where the door leading down to the basement stood slightly open. It was dark and cool there. The damp smell of stone and old wood reminded me of shipholds from long ago. I wasn't looking for anything. I just needed a place to breathe. But as I stepped down a few stairs, I heard voices. Heather's voice, no longer gentle, no longer controlled. She spoke fast and sharp, like someone celebrating a victory too early. Another man answered. I recognized him as the best man, the one who had stayed close to Jason all evening. Too close. I stood still in the dark. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but they spoke too clearly. Heather said everything was done, that Jason would sign the final papers within the week, that this house, these connections were just stepping stones. She laughed when she mentioned how Jason believed he was building a family. There was no joy in that laugh, only the carelessness of someone who thinks no one can touch her. The man asked about the good son. Heather said Jason would be handled later, that once he was no longer useful, he would be nothing more than a name on paper. I heard the coldness in her voice, the kind of coldness that belongs to someone who has never seen people as people. I didn't go down any farther. I didn't need to. I had heard enough. I turned back, my heart beating slow and heavy. On the way back to the reception, I pulled my old phone from my pocket. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't fast. But it still worked. I turned on the recorder not to seek pity, but to hold on to something they would not be able to deny. When I returned to the corner, Betty was still there. She was exhausted. Her head leaned to one side, her eyes half closed. The line was still there. I knelt in front of her, blocking her from other people's view. I whispered that I was here. She took my hand. The grip was weak, but strong enough for me to know she was trying. Heather appeared behind me. She said I was making things messy, that I should let adults handle adult matters. I didn't answer. I stood up and looked straight at her. For a brief moment, I saw irritation flicker in her eyes. Not because I threatened her, but because I was no longer invisible. The music swelled again. A new performance began at the center of the courtyard. Every eye was pulled away. I understood then that they believed they had hidden everything well enough, that the basement would stay a basement, that the corner would stay a corner. But for me, everything had changed. What I had seen and heard down there was not just a secret. It was proof that the humiliation outside was not accidental. It was part of a plan built calmly, step by step, and I knew from that moment on I was no longer just a man standing and watching. I didn't return to the stage right away. I needed a few minutes to arrange everything in my head the way you inspect every joint before launching a large ship. I walked around to the technical area behind the estate, a place few people visited because there were no decorative lights and no glasses of wine. Only cables, sound, control panels, and LED screens playing preloaded images. I had spent my life with wood, rope, and metal. I knew what could bear weight and what would shift with just a light touch. This system wasn't complicated. It had been set up in a hurry to serve one perfect evening. I didn't break it. I only changed its direction. I plugged my old phone into an auxiliary port. The small screen lit up slowly, as if it too needed a moment to understand what it was about to do. I checked the audio file and the short video from the basement. Nothing graphic, no shocking images, just words. And sometimes words are enough to make everything go quiet. Outside, the music rose. I heard the host announcing the next special moment. This was when they planned to show the love story video. I waited for the right beat, like waiting for the right wave to guide a boat out of the harbor. When the large screen lit up, laughter was still scattered across the crowd. Then the sound changed. No music, only a voice filling the open space. Heather's voice, clear, needing no explanation. Words about closing the door on the past, about people treated as burdens, about a plan spoken too easily. The reception fell silent. Glasses were lowered, eyes turned toward the screen, then toward the bride. I stepped out of the technical area and stood at the edge of the crowd. I didn't look for Jason's eyes. I didn't need to. I only needed to know that Betty was safe. When the recording ended, the short video appeared next. No shocking angles. Just a dark basement, a familiar voice, and the way someone speaks about others when they believe no one is listening. I saw Heather turn, trying to smile, then realizing no one smiled back. Jason stood frozen. For the first time that evening, he looked like someone who had just realized he no longer controlled the room. I didn't speak into the microphone. There was no need. I walked over to Betty. I loosened the line beneath the table very slowly so no one would notice. I helped her stand. She leaned into me, light as a memory. A few people stepped aside automatically, as if the air around us had changed. Whispers began. Someone called for an event organizer. I heard familiar footsteps from the entrance. An old friend of mine, now working with the local authorities, walked in with 2 colleagues. I had called him earlier, not to complain, just to say that something needed serious attention. They didn't rush. They didn't raise their voices. They stood there looking at the screen, paused on a frame clear enough. They asked a few short questions. Direct. Heather's answers didn't flow the way they usually did. Jason tried to step in, but each time he spoke, he sounded out of sync. The crowd began to drift away. No one wanted to stay once the party was no longer a party. The same people who had clapped earlier were now busy looking for their coats. The shine faded quickly, leaving behind an awkward emptiness. I led Betty outside toward the path along the coast. The air was cooler. The sounds behind us grew distant. I heard someone call my name, but I didn't turn around. Some conversations don't need to happen right away. When I looked back one last time, I saw Jason standing alone under dimmed lights. He watched us leave, but didn't call out again. I didn't feel anger. I only felt a distance forming clear as the horizon. I knew this wasn't the end. What had just happened was only the moment the truth was placed on the table. The rest would unfold slowly the way things need to be done. But right then, as I felt Betty's hand gently tighten around mine, I knew I had done the only thing I could do on a night like that. Not to destroy a wedding, but to close a door that had been opened the wrong way, and to open another path quieter but fairer. We left the estate late that night. The lights behind us slowly disappeared behind the line of coastal pines. I didn't look back again. There are places that once you walk away from them, you don't need to carry their memories with you. Betty walked slowly, but her steps were lighter than before. I matched my pace to hers the way I had for many years so she wouldn't feel like she was being led. The days that followed were quiet. No music, no lights, only brief phone calls, formal letters, and procedures that needed to be completed. I won't recount every detail. I simply did what needed to be done in order, like repairing a damaged ship, removing each piece that had been fitted wrong, putting back what belonged in its proper place. Heather disappeared from our lives faster than I expected. She left behind cold, empty spaces, but no one tried to fill them. Jason was different. One afternoon he came to see me while I was sitting on the wooden bench in front of the house, watching the tide rise and fall. He stood there for a long time before speaking. No excuses, no blame, just a request for a chance to talk. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I let him say everything he had been carrying. When he fell silent, I told him that some mistakes can't be undone, only continued from a different direction. I made no promises. I didn't close the door completely either. I only said that things take time, and that silence is sometimes a necessary part of repair. The seaside estate was sold. I didn't keep something built on manipulation and disregard. The money didn't make us wealthy, but it was enough for something Betty and I had talked about long ago, back when her memory was still clear. We created a small fund to support older people who are losing their ability to make decisions, so they wouldn't have to depend on the unpredictable kindness of others. I didn't name the fund after myself. I named it after Betty, not because she needed honor, but because she represented those whose voices are no longer loud enough in rooms full of power. When I signed the final papers, she sat beside me and asked what we were doing. I told her we were helping people like her. She nodded, satisfied, then asked if I had eaten dinner. Our life became smaller. No more parties, no more social gatherings. We moved into a smaller house, closer to the sea, Every morning I walk Betty along the shoreline. Some days she tells me about a trip I don't remember. Some days she asks me my name. I answer each time as if it were the first, without impatience, without explanation. Some afternoons when the sun sits low, she holds my hand and says she feels safe. She doesn't know why. She just knows the feeling is familiar. In those moments I say nothing. I only squeeze her hand gently so she knows I'm still here. I think often about that wedding night, not with bitterness, but as a marker in time. It taught me that glamour can hide many things, but not for long. It also taught me that silence has a cost, and sometimes that cost is too high if paid at the wrong moment. Jason calls from time to time. Our conversations are short, about the weather, about work, about things that don't hurt. I don't know what the future holds. I only know this: I will never again let convenience or ambition decide in place of kindness. One morning, when the sea was calmer than usual, Betty stopped and looked at me for a long time. She asked how long we had been married. I told her the number spoken out loud. She smiled as if hearing a good story. Then she said she was lucky. I asked why. She said because there was someone who always held her hand, whether she remembered or not. I looked out at the ocean, where the waves continued their work without needing an audience. I thought about the castles that rise and fall in a single night, and I understood that in the end what remains is not the lights or the applause. It is the hand you hold when everything else has gone quiet. I'll end the story here. If this story touched you, please subscribe to the channel, tap like, and share it so others can listen too. Sometimes a story isn't just for entertainment, but to remind us that money and status may come and go, but how we treat our family stays with us for a very long time. Be kind while you still can, and don't stay silent in the face of what's wrong, because silence is also a choice, and it isn't always the right one. Thank you for listening.